Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Sinister Story Hour. I'm your host, Steph. Thank you for joining me. Every week, we dive into a new case of something true crime, cults, paranormal experiences, conspiracies, or anything else sinister. So join me as we delve into each case, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I do. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Sinister Story Hour. Another week with your host, Steph. If this is your first time joining, thank you so much for being here. And if it's not, welcome back. So we will get into our story. It begins tonight with a popular song that was released in 1941. I remember hearing this song when I was a little kid, and I did not realize how old it was, but my dad would actually sing this song when I was a kid. It was sung by an artist named Ernest Tubb. He actually wrote this song, and it would end up being his biggest hit. It says, "I'm walking the floor over you. I can't sleep a wink, that is true. I'm hoping and I'm praying as my heart breaks right in two. Yes, I'm walking the floor over you." So maybe some of you have heard that. As we get into our story, we are going back to 1950 to 1954, and we are going to Casper, Wyoming. Most likely you have never heard about this story. I had never heard of it. I have lived in Wyoming pretty much my entire life. I have never heard of these people. I got the idea from the podcast called Dead and Gone in Wyoming, and it is done by Scott Fuller. And it is such an interesting podcast that deals with only Wyoming cases throughout quite a few years. I mean, there's several years of a span. And so some of my information tonight will be from the Dead and Gone in Wyoming podcast with Scott Fuller. Otherwise, the biggest source I used were actual court documents, and I've listed those in the show notes as well. And then there was also a page on Wyoming cases that I did reference as well in my research. So all of my sources for this episode will be listed in the show notes, and I would encourage you to just check those out. There are so many pictures of old-time Casper, Wyoming that were very interesting and fun to look at as well. Now, if you've never been to Wyoming, let me set the scene just a little bit. Present-day Wyoming is very rural. 1950 Wyoming, very rural. I can only imagine. Police departments, even today, very inexperienced, I would say, on the crime spectrum because we don't deal with a whole lot of crime here. We don't have a whole lot of exposure to things like that in our police departments. So I can only imagine that back then it was even more so. At the intersection of Center and First Street, there were 3 of the best hotels. And in those hotels, they would often hold dances. Dances back then in Wyoming were a huge deal. Even in the area where I live, I have been told about dances that would happen, and my grandparents would travel miles to go to these dances, and often horseback even to go to these. So it was a big deal. Now, dances were held in the downtown area of Casper, and in these hotels, there were quite a few different bars and things that were located in there. It talked about how in downtown Casper, you could often hear Fridays and Saturday nights the sound of music and the sound of laughter. After the Prohibition ended, there was obviously bars there. The Tomahawk Bar was there. The Petroleum Club was there. So throughout the 50s, that downtown area on Center Street was just filled with good times, with bands dancing. And inside of one of those hotels, as I mentioned, was the Petroleum Club, and that was a very popular place for politicians, the movers and the shakers of Wyoming, if you can believe there are any, but we do have them apparently. Back in the day, Casper was quite a popular place for politicians and oil tycoons. We have to remember oil was a huge industry, and Chick Erickson's 8-piece band often played the latest big band hits. So big band was all the rage, and that was what most people were dancing to at these dances. Oil tycoons in the area, they were there either hanging out alone looking for a mate. They were there with their wives, or they were there with their mistresses. And definitely a little of everything was hanging out at the Petroleum Club. Now, one of those people didn't exactly fit into either one of those categories of the oil tycoon or the politician, and he wasn't exactly a mover or a shaker, but he was a very charming man. He had once been a volunteer fireman from Connecticut, and he had moved to Wyoming with his wife. This person we are going to talk about, his name is James Alexander, and his wife's name was Rose. So James Alexander had actually come to Wyoming from Connecticut in 1944, and he was now the high school shop teacher, Natrona County High School in Casper. So it's funny to me that all of these very important people are there, and here's Jim, and he is basically just fitting into the clique, and everybody seemed to really like him. Everybody said he was very charming, and he did hang out at the Petroleum Club quite a lot from the sound of it. Now, according to court doc, I mentioned that I used quite a bit for the show. Jim and Rose had 2 children. At some point, Jim decides to bring in a woman named Barbara Roop, and I don't really know why he wanted to bring her in to live with them, other than the fact that he was attracted to her. She was a 19-year-old woman at this time, and so I believe that he was just a middle-aged man attracted to a 19-year-old woman, but I'm not positive about that. So he does decide to bring her in to live with them. Now, she is also married at the time with 2 children. So she goes and she lives with Jim and Rose. Before long, you can imagine what happens. Both marriages end up falling apart. Both couples are divorced. And Jim takes on a new wife, Barbara, the young, beautiful 19-year-old. Hey guys, have you thought about making your own podcast, but you're not really sure where to start? That's how I was at first, and really the only choice that stood out to me was Anchor. And let me tell you why. It was completely free to start, and it has all the tools that allow me to record and edit my podcast right from my phone or computer. And they distribute the podcast for me, so it's heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other platforms. There's no minimum listenership, and you can start making money from day one. And really everything you need to make your podcast is all in one place. I love it, and I know you will too. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. It was 1950 when Jim and Rose divorced, and instead of moving back to Connecticut as most people thought she would do, Rose continues to live in the home with this big happy family. Why not, right? She has not coped well at all with the idea of divorce. The idea of letting Jim go has not set well, and she's not ready. She's not ready to let him go. So she clearly still has feelings for Jim. She's not leaving the house, and she just sticks around. So now we have Barbara, her 2 children, Rose, their 2 children, and Jim. So we have 7 people in this house. It's kind of an awkward combination, right? So 8 months after the divorce, Barbara gives birth to a child. Do the math there, friends. But Barbara gives birth to a child and finally objects to how they're living and says, okay, this isn't working for me. She basically ends up trying to pay Rose to go back to Connecticut. Just please get out of our way. Go back with your family. I will pay for you to do that. Now, Rose accepts, but she couldn't exactly handle being away. So pretty soon she came back to Wyoming, and she starts living in a trailer house that's right behind their home on the same property. Now, it wasn't long before Barbara starts noticing that Jim and Rose are meeting up occasionally. Jim is spending a little bit too much time out visiting Rose, if you know what I mean. So she does believe there's something still going on with this couple. Sometime in the month of June 1953, Jim had raised his water meter in his basement so that it could be read from the outside of his basement window. which in itself does not seem odd to me. Still today, somebody has to come and read your water meter to see how much water you've used throughout the month, record that, and that's the usage that you're billed on. And so for them to have to come into your home, into the basement to read your meter every month, I mean, it doesn't seem like a stretch for him to have done that. The part that seemed odd was that, however, during the same month, he had also had Barbara sign some blank conveyancing deeds. So it's basically like signing a blank document saying, I'm going to give you this property. And that seems like it's not good. Barbara was at the home of their next door neighbor on the afternoon of Saturday, July 18th, 1953. And she had left that day around 4 p.m. and she promised to be back the next day. So that night around 10 p.m., the neighbors noticed that there was some sort of a scuttlebutt happening, and they could hear both male and female voices involved in the conflict. And shortly after that, a car resembling Jim's left the backyard and was going fast around the house down the alley. From that night on, the basement door was actually nailed shut. So it was the last night that anybody could have ever accessed the basement door without Jim. So I think we all know where this is going, but we're not getting there just yet, okay? Now, the following day, Barbara, of course, did not visit the neighbor's house. Barbara was never spotted again. I know you're shocked. But the real kicker here is that the next day, Jim actually moves good old Rose back in. Remember ex-wife Rose? Well, she's back. She's back in the picture. She's now caring for all the kids, and she is back in the house. And at some point, I could not actually find the exact date, but at some point, Jim and Rose remarry. One thing I really find was, how did he marry her? If he himself didn't ever want to acknowledge that Barbara was gone, and we'll get into that in just a moment, but if he didn't want to acknowledge that Barbara was actually gone, was actually dead, they weren't divorced. So how did he marry Rose again? Just a question I had, and I never in any of my research was able to find that. So on Monday, July 20th, Jim leaves Casper. Some reports that I read said that he went to Worland, Wyoming. Other reports said that he actually went back to Connecticut to visit family. But basically, he was out of town for the next month. So here's Rose holding down the fort in the house that Barbara went missing in, and she's got all the kids. So this man is just leaving her with all the work, right? So he returns about a month later. It's late August by this time. Wyoming is not really, really hot, but late August. So he lays a concrete floor that's approximately 7 feet by 24 feet. Previously, there was a piece that did have concrete and a piece that didn't. So now he's covering the entire thing with concrete. When he's asked about Barbara, Jim never really has the same story to tell. Among all of these tales, he says that she left him, she had threatened suicide, maybe she went and killed herself. He had seen her on the street. He dreamt that she had come to him. I don't know what that one was about. When he slept in the basement, he felt close to her. He actually wrote somebody that on a postcard, that when he slept in the basement, he felt close to her. Also, he flat out told somebody that she was lying in dry cement and lime and she was dead. And he also had told people that the police or the authorities were actually looking for her, that she may have done something wrong. So as you can see, Jim is quite the storyteller, and he can never get a story straight, and he never has the same story twice. I actually loved how they put it in the court documents, because they actually said, quote, "It would serve no good purpose to here recount at length these several testimonies of the defendant, nor even to attempt to summarize their substance," end quote. So basically they're telling them, it does us no good to tell you guys how many stories this guy actually said, and all of this truths and untruths that are in them, because basically it doesn't even matter. None of these things even matter, because none of them are true.